Okay, let's get started here. First, thanks for coming to our panel, which is entitled Will Iran Go Nuclear? I'm Ji-hyang Jang, Director of the Middle East and North Africa Center here at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Okay, today we have Iranian, Israeli, Turk, American, and Korea. So if you really wanted to know about Iranian nuclear program, you are in the right place. Okay, let me briefly introduce our panelists first. Okay, gentleman sitting right next to me is Dr. Stephen Miller. Dr. Miller is a director of International Security Program in Belfast Center at Harvard University. And also he is a editor-in-chief of journal International Security and a co-chair of the U.S. Pugwash Committee and also senior research fellow at CIPRI. And next to Dr. Miller, we have Mr. Nasser Sagafi Ameri from Iran. Mr. Sagafi is an independent research scholar right now, but he was former senior diplomat and served 32 years in the Iranian diplomatic missions in Ottawa, Stockholm, and New Delhi. And also he was a member of the Iranian delegation to the UN in Geneva and New York, dealing with international security and disarmament issues. And now he is very involved in scholarly activity after his retirement. And then we have Dr. Ahmet Kasım Han from Turkey. And Dr. Han is a professor at Kadir Has University in Istanbul. And he was chief editorial advisor of Turkish edition of New Perspectives Quarterly. And also he was an international relations advisor for Turkish Expert Assembly. And he published many articles about Afghanistan and geostrategy of energy politics. And finally, we have General Uzi Rubin from Israel. General Rubin is a CEO of Rubicon Limited right now. And also he was a founder and former director of Israel Missile Defense Organization in the Israel Ministry of Defense. And also he was senior director for proliferation and technology in the Israel National Security Council. And then he got awarded the Israel Defense Prize twice. Okay. Today we are going to deal with mainly two questions, I think. The first one is about more fundamental one, which is actually the title of our panel itself. So, will Iran go nuclear? That is going to be the first question. And second question is more about so-called smart sanctions in Iran, and then the role of international community. Okay, let's start with the first one. Okay, do you think Iran will go nuclear? I mean, why and why not? And what is your rationale behind your assessment? And if Iran does so, what's the stance and strategy of your own country? You know, last week, actually right after the third nuclear test of North Korea, Iran announced that this country converted some of its higher grade enriched uranium into just, reactor fuel. But then at the same time, we heard different things, like, okay, the third nuclear test by the North Korea was highly financially supported by Iranian government. So, what do you think? There are tremendously complicated, interests and hidden agendas and calculations and incentives around this issue, at least among these four countries. For the United States, seemingly we know that Iranian nuclear is much more troublesome than North Korea nuclear program because we assume that if Iran will go nuclear, pretty sure that other countries such as Turkey, Egypt, Saudi wants to go to nuclear as well. So there's no containment for Iranian nuclear program. And also for Iran, even though Iran kept arguing that the presence of Israeli nuclear arsenal is really big threat to Israel. But if we look at the map, those Israeli nuclear threat is much more crucial to, say, Jordan, even Turkey and GCC countries than Iran, who is sitting just here, than here. And also for Turkey, although Turkey is a big supporter of WMD-free zone in the Middle East and is de-emerging in middle power in the international community, but Turkey pretty sure they wants to go nuclear if Iran goes nuclear. So, what do you think? And finally, Israel. Well, although Israel cannot deter, the attacks from Hamas and Hezbollah, who are really using conventional weapons rather than, nuke, then why do you bother to keep, your nuclear arsenal in your country? Why don't you just give up the nuclear program and just go to lead the WMD-free zone in the Middle East? So, panelists, you have 5 to 7 minutes to discuss about the first question. So please, Dr. Miller.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me echo other speakers in thanking the Asan Institute for including me in this very interesting occasion, and also for including some attention to the other intractable, unsolvable nuclear crisis. Since much of this meeting is devoted to North Korea, we're a little bit of a change of pace. And let me try to start with where we are in this Iran crisis. And whatever one thinks about Iran's intentions, the reality is that Iran has achieved the technical ability to produce weapons-usable nuclear material. And so I think one of the basic questions in front of us in a policy sense today is whether we're prepared to live with that latent nuclear weapons capability that Iran presently possesses. For the United States, the answer is not entirely clear, but possibly we could live with this capability. For Israel, I suspect the answer may be more clear and more negative. But if you believe that we cannot live with an Iran that possesses a latent nuclear weapons option, even if that option is not exercised, then the capability has to be eliminated one way or another. So that's one starting point. Now, it's obvious that a principal goal of American and Western policy over the past decade and more has been to prevent precisely the emergence of this capability. And once the capability started to emerge, we tried very hard to stop it, to freeze it. We still have the objective of reversing it and eliminating it. This has been a basic goal of U.S. policy. We have been sitting on a position more or less unchangingly for a very long time that zero enrichment is the only acceptable outcome in Iran. And we've pursued this objective through a policy built on a coercive approach centered on pressure and sanctions. And we've tried this layer after layer of sanctions and pressure after pressure. And what one has to say is that so far this policy has failed to achieve our core objectives. It has had some impacts, of course, but it has not helped us achieve our objectives. And so I think we're now confronting a second basic question, which is, can we prevent weaponization, right? That's our fundamental goal. The ideal goal is to prevent enrichment. We've failed in that. and if we cannot reverse enrichment, then our basic goal has to be preventing weaponization. And so a second core issue, I think, in front of us is what strategy is most likely to prevent the weaponization of Iran's existing nuclear capabilities and growing nuclear capabilities. And of course, we're having quite an intense debate about this question, and the spectrum runs from the use of force through the continuation of coercive diplomacy to the possibility of trying to utilize inducements and more genuine bargaining as an approach to preventing weaponization. Now, your choice of strategy, we don't have time in my 5 minutes to get into the details of these different choices, but your choice of strategy depends very heavily on your judgment about Iran's genuine intentions. And if you believe, as much of Washington does and as American policy is premised, that the Supreme Leader is committed to obtaining nuclear weapons despite his public statements to the contrary, then and that the Iranian government likewise, then the argument is that we have no choice but to pursue a coercive strategy in which the pain and cost associated with Iran's current nuclear policy gradually but inexorably becomes so high that Iran's calculus changes and they have to alter their course. On the other hand, if you think that Iran is preparing itself a weapons option but has not yet made a weaponization decision, then the strategy choice becomes more complicated because it's possible that being too coercive, too threatening, too much moving in the direction of the use of force could resolve any Iranian debate in the direction of acquiring nuclear weapons. We could persuade Iran that they need nuclear weapons by behaving too harshly towards them. Now, here we have a long-standing debate about what Iran's intentions are, and the official position of U.S. intelligence, and I believe it's echoed by Israeli intelligence, but we can hear from our Israeli colleague, is that Iran had a weapons program, but that it was stopped in 2003, and the U.S. intelligence services have now issued two reports, one in the end of the Bush administration and one more recently, saying that they have high confidence in the judgment that Iran has not made a decision to weaponize its nuclear capabilities. So if you accept that argument, and many people don't, but if you do, then you're in a more complicated strategic calculation. Now, Iran itself denies that it has any interest in pursuing nuclear weapons, and the Supreme Leader has made a number of statements, including most recently just on the 16th of February, 2 or 3 days ago, flatly denying that Iran has any interest in nuclear weapons, proclaiming them to be a crime against humanity, calling for the elimination of all nuclear weapons in the states that possess them, and insisting that not only does Iran not want nuclear weapons, but that American and other leaderships know this and nevertheless artificially manufacture this nuclear crisis as part of the broader campaign against the Islamic Republic of Iran. So if you take those articulations as definitive, and many of my Iranian colleagues do, then there's no real issue here. However, very few in the Western debate attach definitive weight, and in many cases attach no weight at all to what the Supreme Leader says. And there is an argument that says instead that this rhetoric is simply camouflage that's intended to hide the purposeful pursuit of nuclear weapons. And what I think one ends up seeing is that Iranian leaders often comment publicly that it's obvious that they're not going for nuclear weapons. And American leaders often comment publicly just the opposite, that it's obvious that Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons because there's no other rational explanation for a number of the technical decisions that Iran has made. And what this suggests, I think, is that we have two narratives that have very little points of interaction or intersection. And what this means in reality, as we try to address this issue, especially using diplomacy, is that we come at this issue with a very high level of mutual incomprehension and with absolutely opposite premises undergirding our respective postures. And let me just close by trying more frontally to address the question. I've tried to kind of sketch a little bit of the context here. Will Iran go nuclear? Well, obviously not if the Supreme Leader's words are definitive about this subject, but the big worry in the outside world is that they are not. But I think there are reasons for thinking that we're not likely to see nuclear weapons in Iran's hands in the near term, in part because of efforts explicit on the part of the American government, but also on the part of others to try and deter that outcome, to make it clear to Iran that any move in the direction of actual possession of nuclear weapons would trigger very strong reactions, including possibly the use of force. I think there has been a concerted effort over a very long period of years to communicate to Iran that the costs of nuclear acquisition would be very high, the diplomatic, the political, the economic costs. Among other things, this would erase all of the gray zones in which Iran's friends have operated and resisted American pressures for harsher sanctions and so on. I think that if you think carefully about making the transition from having a weapons capability, an ability to produce a weapon or two, to actually having a meaningful operational nuclear arsenal, that there's a transitional vulnerability in there that would be a very dangerous phase for Iran to traverse. It's certainly the case that if Iran sought to acquire nuclear weapons using the declared facilities, that they would be detected because these facilities are safeguarded and they don't have a dash capability to a bomb that is shorter than the inspection cycles to which they are subjected. But it's also the case that if Iran does this covertly, as many fear and suspect, that they have to worry about the risk of detection. And while we can't be certain that we will detect a covert program, they can't be certain that we won't. And if they were detected, then this would be raise all of these other penalties. So for all these reasons, I think that Iran is most likely to live with a nuclear weapons option, but not actually weaponize that capability.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miller. Mr. Sagafi, do you want to add, or do you want to?
We surely agree completely.
Especially on the last part of your talks, I've enjoyed in many occasions being in the same panel with Dr. Miller. But before beginning, I would like to join others thanking the ASAN for organizing this very informative forum and for inviting me, Dr. Jung. This is my first visit to South Korea, and I think this topic, especially when I witnessed the speakers, many speakers talked about North Korea's nuclear test, and implicitly they mentioned about the linkage between North Korea and Iran was quite interesting. I should say, starting from this point, because I'll come back to the main question, there is no doubt that Iran is against nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction, and I'll explain it in the next few minutes. Either be by North Korea or any other country, that doesn't matter. And I think they have deplored that test also. So this is for your information. And by the way, the relationship between countries are very much manifested in the trade and other areas that one can judge upon that. And you can just compare the level of trade and other interactions between Republic of Korea with Iran to North Korea with Iran. So that very much explains everything. The question is, Iran is going nuclear is very much provocative, I should say. And I welcome that question because it gives a chance to explain why Iran is after a peaceful nuclear program. Since 1960, when Iran began its nuclear program, thanks to U.S. assistance at that time, till now, as far as I know, and I was in the foreign ministry since 1968, and I pursued all things related to nuclear issues. Iran never intended to have nuclear weapons from the beginning. One of the main incentives that Iran became a strong supporter of NPT, in fact, was to gain the confidence of its allies of that time, which was the United States and Europeans, to help it to develop its nuclear program. 20 nuclear power plants were supposed to be installed in Iran by 1980. And then, as we know, the revolution came, and after the revolution, for a period of gap of time, and then Iraq's invasion of Iran, and finally after the war, Iran considered to reconstruct its nuclear program. It approached first Germany, which was constructing the Bushehr power plant, and then because of American pressure, Germans didn't come forward, then approached certain other countries, Argentina, others, and finally China, which also withdrew because of American pressure. And as we know, it was after the fall of the Soviet Union and the beginning of the new Russia, which was coming into the scene, that they agreed to carry on the project. The project took a long time, as we know, and just recently it is operational. I mean, the power plant came into line. So it is quite reasonable for everybody to ask themselves why it took so long for Iran, if it wanted to have nuclear weapons, to go all this way and to face these hassles. By the way, Pakistan developed its nuclear weapons within 10 years with much less resources and technology. And there is no good reason that why Iran couldn't. In fact, right now there are pressures by many countries, I should say, in practice, putting sanctions on others, including nuclear weapon states, that wish Iran to weaponize its program. But Iran resists because of the following points that I'm going to make. First, it is moral and religious obligation. As mentioned by Professor Miller, Supreme Leader, who has the final say in Iran's strategic and foreign policy issues, has declared many times that it is forbidden, according also to religious edicts. And secondly, Iran has a history of being a victim of weapons of mass destruction, a very recent experience. 100,000 victims of chemical weapons, which 5,000 to 6,000 of them still are there in Iran and are vivid case of victims of weapons of mass destruction. At that time, when the regime of Saddam Hussein was deploying chemical weapons against Iran, major powers and unfortunately the United Nations kept silent, didn't do anything. But the memory of what happened, and it is live there in our society, compels Iran not to pursue weapons of mass destruction. The third point and third reason is called deterrence, nuclear deterrence, so-called, to deter any kind of aggression by other states, especially when the United States from time to time says that all the options are on the table, so-called. And then Israel is openly and against the Charter of the United Nations is making statements that they want to attack Iran. So one would ask what deterrence Iran would have. And I think Professor Miller was quite right. Everybody would think that with all nuclear weapon states surrounding Iran, Israel, Russia, China, Pakistan, India, and not to say United States, which is almost neighbor of Iran on both sides of the border. So everybody would say the most rational thing that Iran might do is to go and weaponize its program. But no, that is not the case. What Iran is having as deterrence is based on conventional weapons, especially on range of missiles. And if you review Iran's arsenals and what is pursuing in armaments, it is almost all of them defensive, not offensive. So these are good indications with the doctrine of asymmetric confrontation to rely and be confident that it can resist any kind of aggression against itself. But there is a but. I think on a larger scale, if Iran ever would be attacked by a nuclear weapon state, being Israel or the United States, because even if Israel would attack, Iran has declared that it will consider the United States as an aggressor and it will respond to that. But in a broader sense, the NPT will collapse certainly. This will be the first consequence of the attacking Iran. So I think this was in a nutshell what I wanted to say, but in the Q&A, if there would be any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sagafi. Okay, Dr. Han, somehow you're sitting between Iran and Israel, so do you want to?
Well, it's been said that being in Korea for a Turk is a special experience, so I would again extend the usual thanks to organizers for having me here in this remarkable conference, first of all. Robert Gilpin once stated that prestige rather than power is the everyday currency of international relations. With prestige comes influence, and influence is the reputation for power. Of course, hard power is not the only avenue to prestige, but as the story of international relations go, it still is a solid avenue to that end. And the nuclear arsenal is one of the most credible testimonies of hard power yet invented. Iran might be 20 yards, even 10 yards away from that capability and influence it brings, as Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has remarked, or far from a touchdown, so to speak. Though one thing is clear, it is definitely within the game. And when it comes to playing the Super Bowl of influence in the Middle East, it is one of the credible contenders, as is today. Obviously, even today, the Islamic Republic is an indisputably important actor with its culture of statecraft, which I really utter very high importance to, history, its position in this Sunni-Shia rivalry in the region that is emerging and getting more grave, its role in Afghanistan, ability to reflect power in Gulf, to name a few, The list of venues to play for Iran is not limited to those. If it chooses to, there are a lot of other avenues that it can choose to play. And as such, Iran is already an important actor. And I would say Iran, as such, again, possesses two kinds of capabilities. One that corresponds to denial, what I would call denial capabilities, as, say, peace in Afghanistan. I remember Iranian diplomats telling me that Iran is not powerful enough to build any peace in Afghanistan, but it is certainly powerful enough to stop any peace that it doesn't like to take shape from taking shape. And for Syria, for that matter, the same story applies, I believe. So it has a denial capability. And that denial capability, of course, extends to the Gulf region, which is very important for the obvious reasons. So it can oppose what she doesn't want, although it cannot impose what it wants. The second set of capabilities are that of nuisance capabilities, as in, say, Lebanon, through Hezbollah over Israel. What it lacks, though, is the immunity such a double game of denial and nuisance requires in the short to mid-term. This is primarily how the Iranian regime feels it can fend off the threat it perceives by the nuclear program that it has. The nuclear program will provide them with the capability to shift the gear. In the long term, the fruits of the program will enable Iran to take its place at the higher table of international politics. Again, Iranian experts time and again repeatedly said that this is a game between big powers. Big powers meaning United States and Iran, and it should be definitely debated on equal terms. And equal terms in that regard mean balance of power. Sometimes Iranians use that acronym for saying that they would like to negotiate equally, or balance of interests, and interest is always a vague concept. But it is this immunity that will come with the nuclear program, and I'm not referring to nuclear arms here, nuclear program, that Iran is after, in my opinion. And this has a logical extension, this line of thought has a logical extension. That immunity, of course, will provide Iran to freely continue the double game of denial and nuisance. Even the existing strategic ambiguity of about the state of its nuclear program alone enables it to exercise an undeniable level of influence as it is right now, independent of the question of the state and nature of its nuclear program. I personally do believe that Iran will stop a yard short of a stockpile, because being as one expert has said, a screwdriver away from the bomb is enough for Iran. And it has that right, by the way, under the NPT regime, to develop nuclear energy. What it doesn't have the right to is, or what is problematic is how it will stockpile the capability, not the weapons itself. And I don't see in my deliberations with my Iranian colleagues, old and new, I would say that I have never felt on the Iranian side a consensus on building a bomb. Well, the good news of this scenery is that there is no smoking gun, no reason to dent our ordinary lives, as I have read General Rubin said in an interview. The bad news is it will pretty much mean an Iran, short of a nuclear weapons capability, but definitely able to acquire if it wants to, will pretty much mean all of the same consequences for the regional system as an actually bombastic, I would say, Iran. Deteriorating an already destabilized regional system with the Arab Spring, with Syria, with Palestine, Israel, and whatnot. With a discredited US after Iraq, current state of oil prices and world economy, and Israel is Israel, Iranian Republic, Islamic Republic will have no denial, nuisance, and immunity, will now have denial, nuisance, and immunity capabilities, as well as the intervention capability. By the way, when I say intervention capability, I don't mean a hot intervention, a hard power intervention, but definitely intervention on coercive terms, say on smaller Gulf states, not on Saudi Arabia. So by stopping short of a nuclear stockpile, Iran will have all of the consequences that it would otherwise like to have on the regional system. It will have its enhanced influence, it will have coercive capability, what I call the immunity capability, and will go on with its politics as usual game. So Iran actually does not need actual possession of nuclear weapons. The program in itself is enough, and it has already received that to an extent. That is definitely not good news for an aspiring power like Turkey, with its increased aspiration for independence in its foreign affairs. And Turkey also has a completely different disposition when it comes to foreign affairs strategy relative to Iran. The Turks realize that the threat is out there. A nuclear-capable Iran, even though short of a stockpile, will have, as I said, all the regional weight that it requires to stop Turkish influence from getting into what Turkey's current decision-makers want it to go. The deal of May with Brazil on board was a reflection of it, while the no vote to the Security Council resolution 1929 was a testimony that Turkey is not ready to give up its regional aspirations. It was not only for Turkey a credibility gap if it said yes to the Security Council resolution improving sanctions on Iran, resolution number 1929 I'm referring to, it would have had a great credibility gap in terms of its foreign policy at that moment. Also, there was enormous pressure on the government itself to say no for the vote, both from Islamist circles, which kind of form the core of the constituency of the ruling party, but also from outside. Even the laicist circles did try to corner the government by displaying the inconsistency in its foreign policy had it voted yes for the Security Council resolution 1929. Plus, it was a sign of continuity for Turkish foreign policy, because traditionally Turkey tends to downplay Iranian aspirations or threat. That is mainly because of economic reasons. Because Turkey does have huge and very important, first of all, energy relations and foreign trade with Iran. These energy relations, despite the sanctions, the importation of gas and oil from Iran is continuing right now with different ways of payment as is valid right now among the two countries. I would get into the details of that if any questions are asked. But it is also important because Iran happens to be the second supplier in the face of no other alternatives when it comes to hydrocarbons. Plus, the two countries have a keen understanding of the balance of power amongst them. I would like to remind you that Turkish energy minister very recently said that anyone who wanted Turkey to go forward with the sanctions regime as it is required by the United States and its allies should be able to prove a very solid alternative to Turkey's relations with Iran. Hence, it is impossible. Will Turkey go nuclear in the face of all these, if I have to wrap up? I don't think so, and I would never think that Turkey will pursue such a road under the current circumstances. there are a set of reasons, organizational, legal reasons, that it is a signatory of the NPT and an advocate of the NPT for a very long time. It's a member of NATO, and if it ever wants to become an EU member, it has to sign Euratom. And so that's impossible on those terms. There are economic reasons. With the current account deficit Turkey is running right now, a nuclear program which is very pricey, is impossible to aspire for. The nuclear triad is, it is far from impossible, I would say that. The current economic relations, as I had referred to them, amongst Iran and Turkey, does not allow that. Turkey goes the other way around, but Turkey's own economic situation also does not permit to pursue an independent nuclear program. Turkey's foreign policy strategy entirely does not allow for that, because it wants to become again a member of UN Security Council. It is a member of G20, wants to improve its standing in G20, and wants to alter the structures of G20 to provide its foreign policy more soft power leverage. Last but not the least, on that account, we want to have a Clausewitzian security environment in Turkey, considering the extent of the army and the population that we have. And the development programs when it comes to weapons system in Turkey concentrates more on that regard. Clausewitzian kind of weapons, which would keep still war being an extension of politics by other means, rather than having nuclear weapons which will entirely transform that venue. There are also domestic political reasons, which I'm going to enter if, again, any questions are asked because of the time constraints. And there are what I would call the gadget arguments, basically that the technological constraints are out there and they are huge, and Turkey will not in the short to middle term be able to credibly develop those alternatives, those nuclear capabilities. When all is said and done, with current assurances by its allies, including the missile defense system that has its radar component established in Turkish soil, Turkey is happy with the current status quo. It feels itself under the umbrella of NATO's assurances. As long as those assurances are not questioned on double fronts, US and EU, for some reasons that might occur, Turkey will not change its disposition on the issue. Or there should be, for Turkey to change its position, there should be a drastic change in the assessment and assessment of Turkish decisions, civilian decision makers, that is, on the nature of the security environment and interests surrounding Turkey. And these are lacking. So I wouldn't think that, I wouldn't say that Turkey would ever go and pursue a nuclear program, even if Iran goes nuclear, which I don't believe will be the case in the short term. Turkey's nuclear aspirations and its current sponsorship from Russia is mainly targeted for economic reasons. Turkey is running a 6.5% growth in its electricity needs, and this will continue as a trend annually until 2030. And Turkey needs the energy that nuclear power provides to them, considering that it's a country with no natural resources on that level when it comes to hydrocarbons. And the nuclear program that Russia offers to Turkey right now in the form of 4 nuclear reactors, 1,200 megawatts each, actually entails a model which will never sponsor Turkey's going nuclear in terms of nuclear weapons.
Okay, thank
So
you,
I'll
Dr.
stop
Han.
here.
Okay, somehow so far our panelists kind of argue that Iran will not go nuclear, but let's hear about our fourth panelist opinion. And please, General Rubin.
Thank you. That's first is the experience to be in South Korea, although it's not my first time, but it is an experience to be the only engineer in a panel of political scientists. So it's quite an experience to explain things from an engineering point of view. As an engineer, I've got I've been asked one question, will Iran go nuclear? And I have a one-word answer, but I will not say it now because then I'll ruin the whole show.
Well, you can
Yes,
say.
but let me go into my prepared notes. I'm unfortunately, I'm not a nuclear expert, and therefore I'm not going to count centrifuges and percentage. And fortunately, I'm not a nuclear expert, and because of that, I look outside from a more, I'd say, a ecumenical point of view. And when I watch Iran as a country, I see not just a nuclear program. I see actually 3 interrelated programs, although to the usual audience it doesn't seem related, although 2 of them do. It's a nuclear program, a nuclear enrichment program. I'm not talking about a nuclear electricity production program. This is obviously under control for generating electricity. I'm talking about nuclear enrichment. I'm talking about the ballistic missile program. And I'm talking about the space program. All those are usually the triad of programs that when you see them together, they spell out eventually a nuclear strike force. And the latest manifestation of that we have seen with your neighbors. They have a very strong ballistic missile program. They recently flew a satellite and recently made a nuclear test. All those things usually go together when a country has an aspiration for not just having nuclear weapons, it's not enough, but have a viable nuclear striking force. So I have to look at all 3 of them together. Of course, in the other countries with all those 3 usually have a nuclear strike force. Iran is very careful to explain each component separately. The nuclear enrichment program is portrayed very ably, I must say, in very logical terms as needed to replenish the electrical generation program. Although one should ask the question why you need that in other things, but I don't want to go into that. The missile program is explained, as we heard now from our Iranian colleague here, as actually Iranian deterrence, non-nuclear deterrence. And the space program is, of course, portrayed as a peaceful program for the exploration and exploitation of space. And recently we had this test with a live animal. It goes up and down, although it was much... I congratulate the Iranian scientists for doing that, but it was much ballyhooed. I mean, I was called to the television to say, hey, they put a monkey in space. I say, yeah, well, the monkey went up and went down. That's about 8 minutes in space. It's not a big deal yet. Well, anyway, all those programs are explained by Iran, each one per se, unconnected and unlinked. Again, you look at it from the outside and say unconnected, unlinked, perhaps, if you buy it. But there are several features here that bring some questions to mind. First, the furtive construction of the civilian nuclear facilities. They didn't come up on their own. They were disclosed by outside forces and then considered, and then some more facilities were disclosed and then considered again. And every one has an explanation. And I consider to my Iranian colleagues, their explanations are always very elaborate and built on very, very rationally. But there are explanations. Then there is a rationalization of ever-increasing percentage of enrichment. First, 3.5% needed for nuclear reactors, and then 20% needed for isotope production. And lately we hear about an objection to make nuclear submarines, which needs an even more higher. So again, every time there is a rational explanation for another step. The variety, and I'm a missile expert, the variety of the ballistic missile program is unbelievable. I mean, so many types. I'm not talking about the short-range stuff. I'm talking about the long-range stuff. So many types, and one kind of wonders why they are needed if they are simply deterrents. They have deterrents going through the ears already. And finally, the nuclear-like basing mode. The Iranians disclosed silo basing. What do you need to survival of non-nuclear ballistic missiles in silos? It really kind of brings to mind why protect non-nuclear missiles in a deep dark silo. So all these things are question marks, which brings to some feelings, some suspicion that the programs are linked, they're not unlinked, or at least linked in the sense there is an overarching policy that ties those things together, although each program is run separately. So from the capability point of view, and I think this was mentioned, I won't much add to that, Iran is building, advertently or inadvertently, all the capabilities for nuclear strike force, but it claims a no intention, self-restraint on several counts, and we heard only some of them. I think we hear some more interesting arguments from Iran explaining self-restraint. First is self-interest, saying that avoiding nuclear race with neighbors. I think this is one of the most powerful arguments I heard from Iranian scholars. And in fact, I fully agree with that. The Iranians would do well not only to make nuclear weapons, but not to enrich at all. Why go into this race at all? Why they could have other solutions for Bushehr. There is ethics, as we heard about. Iran is for global zero. After the recent test in North Korea, again, they came out to say that for a global zero, no country should have nuclear weapons. And we have heard about the religious edict, the religious injunctions that nuclear weapons is a sin. But, okay, taking everything together, on all this explanation, but looking at the past record, the past obfuscation, the current objection to unimpeded inspection on account of national sovereignty, and the general Iranian attitude of challenging the existing world order. Iran is not a satisfied power. It's not behaving as a satisfied power. It wants to change the United Nations. It wants to make changes in the region. All those questions, and there are a lot of articles about, bring to mind the question whether this is policy or ploy. Diplomacy is being attempted, and Iran is progressing in all three areas that I mentioned, and it will eventually have all the capability of an incipient nuclear strike force, and that seems to be inevitable. Now, there are countries which have all these three capabilities, but they don't implement them. I agree. Self-restraint works in some countries. Look at Japan up to now. There's some South American countries also could have developed the capabilities. There is a self-restraint. But usually, if you look at what kind of countries they are, the countries which we call with no axe to grind. Well, again, the Japanese today with the islands and the problem with the things, life doesn't remain static. But up to now, the Japanese were one of the most peaceful policies in the world. South Koreans, South Americans don't quarrel with anyone. Not so Iran. Iran has so many axes to grind. It has the force of arrogance that is confronting. Very fiercely, force of arrogance. It demands what we call foreign forces to leave the Middle East. It is intervening in Syria, very massively so. And there is a thing of Israel, which is the most incomprehensible to us Israelis, what the hell Iran has against Israel. Let me share with you the anecdote that we, a group of Israelis, found ourselves in a conference with a group of Iranians, and we took them down. They were very, very friendly people. They said, explain to us what Iran has against Israel. Because we have, you are 1,000 kilometers away. We don't want anything that belongs to you. We don't want anything from you. What the hell do you want from us? So we got a 15-minute, very accurate explanation. We understood nothing. This for us is a complete dilemma. And because of this, I'd say, adversarial attitude of Iran, it is hard to see Iran as one of those countries that will keep restraint. It will have the capability, and here comes my answer. My answer is a lawyer's answer. It depends.
I knew it.
It depends. Not on us, not necessarily on us. It depends. I say if the present course of event continues as it is, that means some diplomacy is being done. Iran continues with all this program towards a Terence score, not a Terence score. I think it's inevitable Iran will become a nuclear power. I'm not saying with how many weapons, and I'm not saying when, because the implementation will be irresistible. It will be irresistible on several counts. First, an adversarial foreign policy will bring forth the conditions under which all previous injunctions, religious injunctions, moral injunctions, and policy decisions will be reversed. Those who made the decision not to nuclearize will make the decision to nuclearize, because they will feel, perhaps rightly so, that they are under dire threat. Another thing which people play down is the force of the military-industrial complex. Iran built an institution now built around all those components. This institution is going, and I see the signs of it in some of the Iranian expression. You see the military-industrial complex speaking already. They will make a tremendous effort within the Iranian debate to turn all the efforts they invested in generations into reality. So I'd say if nothing happens, if trajectory continues, Iran eventually, and I'm not saying when, could be next month, next year, next 10 years, but eventually will become not just an incipient Iranian nuclear power, but a nuclear power, whether it will announce or not, or test or not, again, all these details. There will be. Of course, if the current projection changes either by outside forces or inside forces, this is, as I say, it depends. But I want to mention another possibility here. Iran's nuclear ambitions are a concern to part of the world, obviously concern to Israel. But it does not necessarily have to be like that. It depends more on Iran's general policy than on Iran's nuclear program. If Iran it mellows down, adopts a milder, non-controversial policy towards, and let me say it in a more perhaps poetic way, if Iran learns to live with the world as it is, not as it wants it to be, then the question of Iran's nuclear ambition will lose much of their sharpness and relativity. And with that practical, that fervent hope, I wish to conclude.
Okay, thank you so much, General Rubin. Somehow we are a little behind the schedule, so let's start with our second question, which was about, is there any role for international community, or is there, viable smart sanction for Iran? I mean, last November, I visited Iran and was surprised to observe that there is working economy in Iran, and the ordinary Iranians really did not suffer from bad economy or whatsoever. So I assumed that there was smart sanction working without humanitarian crisis, but only with the asset freeze for the government. And I even thought that probably externally imposed sanction forced Iranian economy to diversify their oil sector and to develop their manufacturing realm, and even to escape from the so-called resource curse of a rentier state. I mean, they did have manufacturing system there. So again, maybe smart sanction is working there. So should we pursue this ongoing smart sanction in Iran, or is there any other role for international community? Because we know the North Korean case, the sanction didn't work. But then, Iran is different from North Korea in many ways. Iran has vivid civil society, Iran has more solid economy, and Iran does have more, say, viable diplomatic channel than North Korea. So what can we do to further pursue smart sanction or other tools? Please, Dr. Miller.
Well, trying to be very brief, sanctions have been at the heart of the American approach to Iran since 1979.
Okay.
There are layers and layers and layers of sanctions. Every time the Iranians do something we don't like, we try more sanctions.
Okay.
And one of the effects of the current nuclear crisis is that the bilateral sanctions have been multilateralized through the UN process. So now we have multiple layers of international sanctions to go along with many, many layers of bilateral sanctions. And I think there's no question that these have had some impact on Iran, and I think they've caused some pain in Iran, and that Iran's economy is less healthy and less vigorous because of these sanctions. However, the objective of the sanctions in the nuclear context was to alter Iran's nuclear behavior. And there they've been, if not a complete failure, then beyond that to be counterproductive. Because in some cases, Iran responded by accelerating its nuclear program. But what we know for certain is that Iran responded to the UN sanctions by systematically retreating from the rather extensive transparency arrangements that it had made. It retreated back to basically its core safeguards agreement. So one by one, all the extra inspection that we were able to do in the period from 2003 to about 2006 were pulled back and taken off the table by Iran in direct, explicit reaction to the sanctions resolutions. This was an intentional signal that if we wanted to hurt them, they were going to be less cooperative. So then the question is, all right, we have decades of sanctions, broadly speaking, and half a dozen years of nuclear-related UN sanctions, none of which have succeeded in achieving our objectives. So is the next level and layer of sanctions going to be the one that breaks the Iranian will to resist? And I have to say that in the debate in Washington, there is still a hope, and I would say even a belief, that we have a noose around Iran's neck and we're slowly but steadily tightening it, and eventually Iran will have to surrender. And there are many advocates who just say the problem with the sanctions policy is that we have never gotten the Chinese and the Russians on board enough to do all the painful things that we would like to do, but slowly but surely these other powers are being drawn into the sanctions mentality, and when they get more fully on board, the sanctions will win, and we will achieve our objectives. The complication is that the sanctions are almost always, in every setting, leaky and imperfect. In anything like the current international diplomatic environment, there are many parties who do not share the American Western view of Iran and its situation. I think symptomatic of this is the fact that Iran was elected head of the non-aligned movement. That's 120 member states. It's more than half of the international system, and I think representing way more than half of the global population, has chosen Iran to be its leader for the current period, starting, was it last year? So Iran is not as isolated as we would like it to be, but there's another dimension, which is that Iran is not an inanimate object. It is able to respond and try to evade what we're trying to do, so we're trying to impose sanctions. Iran has had several decades of experience at evading sanctions, finding ways around them. And so the question is, how long do you think this game can go on, and how long can Iran function at a tolerable level without altering its nuclear behavior in the ways that we desire? And we're running a test of that hypothesis right now. And I think that we just had another layer of sanctions that were put in place just several weeks ago, financial sanctions aimed at making it harder for Iran to complete financial transactions when they actually sell stuff. And then the last point I would make is that if you look over the last decade, one of the great advantages that Iran has had in this game of cat and mouse on economic sanctions is not only does Iran have oil, but oil has been selling at $100 a barrel. And in fact, the high oil prices may well have negated whatever negative impact we were trying to have with our sanctions. And of course, one of the reasons why oil prices were so high was because of American policy in the region, particularly the war in Iraq and all the other destabilizing things that happened. So in a way, our policy was working against itself, and every extra dollar added onto the price of oil was relief for Iran from the consequences of these sanctions. And I just say, as a last point, there is a very strong sense, very much similar to the conversations we heard in an earlier session about North Korea, that we're dealing with a series of events that we find very unattractive, and the outcome that we fear is heading to us is unacceptable, so we need to do something, all right? And then what are the options? What are the options for doing something? And the use of force does not look very desirable in most contexts, and doing nothing is not acceptable, and diplomacy is very difficult and has so far been unsuccessful. And by process of elimination, you're left with sanctions. And in the American context, what one has to say is that from a domestic political point of view, which is very different from achieving the international diplomatic objectives, from a diplomatic point of view, the sanctions have been very successful in allowing administrations to say, we're doing something, and we're being tough on Iran, and we think our policy will eventually work. And so from that point of view, it's a very useful instrument for American politicians.
Somehow I just got the sign that we have only 5 minutes, and I mean, it's all my fault. I'm sorry. Okay, so,
You want me to?
or why don't we gather questions from the floor, and then we can gather the question, and you might have comment toward the questions and to our second question. So any question? Please, Anton.
I'm Anton Hlapko from the Center for Energy and Security Studies from Moscow. A quick comment and one question. A quick comment that there are a lot of discussion whether Iranians were presented at the North Korean nuclear test, by the way, not for the first time, but the irony that the only confirmed case when the Iranians participated in foreign nuclear test was, by the way, a US nuclear test. It's in New Zealand archives because New Zealand person was presented as well. It was during the Shah time, it was 1958, but again, this is the irony of the history. The question to Steve Miller. Steve, it's an open secret that US is reviewing its policy on Iran these days. There is a policy review of policy on Iran in the US these days. Do you think this process could be finished before the elections in Iran, or most likely it will be after? I mean, it will be finished after the elections. And the second part of this question, what are your personal expectations from this process? Because you mentioned that we need some options. The politicians need some options. What your expectations are from this process?
Okay, just one more question.
Takjan Kasyanova with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I have a question for Mr. Sagafi Mary. I was wondering whether you could share your perception of the Tehran Declaration from 2010 and whether you think something similar might be of value and whether you think Iran might be interested in something of a similar type.
Excuse me, 2010, what was the?
The Tehran Brazil-Turkey initiative.
Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Sagafi, you have 1 minute, and Dr. Miller, you have 1 minute, and Dr. Han and General Ruby, you have 30 seconds for wrapping up. Sorry.
I don't remember being asked a question, but I'll speak for 30 seconds.
And we Turks do not speak for 1 minute.
I know that. Okay, Mr. Sagafi.
One point I want, before answering that question, which very much relates to Republic of Korea and sanctions. And that is the sanctions that United States imposed on Iran was, as mentioned by Professor Miller, was layers of sanctions beginning from 1979. And almost U.S. does not have any market in Iran. But imposing new sanctions has caused that some traditional traders with Iran, especially your country, have suffered the great. I'm giving you one example. In the early 1980s, when Japanese firms, under the pressure of the United States, they refused to continue their projects in Iran, especially in the southern part on a large petrochemical complex, they almost lost their market in Iran to your country. In electronics, in cars, and so on. Recently, you are losing your market in Iran to China. You have been to Tehran recently. There are many, many new cars from China. So Iran is not pressed by any mean. Iran is not comparable to North Korea. As I mentioned, it has $70 billion non-oil exports just in 10 months. So this explains United States has mentioned its concern about Iran's links, which is more trade, to South America. So Iran cannot be isolated in that sense. Those countries who have had good trade relationship with Iran will suffer. So this is the point I wanted to make. And then concerning your question, the basic deal was, at that time, was Iran to export its enriched uranium up to 20% to outside and deposit it in Turkey, and instead get fuel for its nuclear research reactor in Tehran. But since then, everything has changed. Iran is manufacturing its own fuel now. Why it should export and deposit it outside? So that is also a question now.
Thank you. Dr. Miller.
On the policy review, I'm unaware of any public articulation of a timetable. But what one has to say is that we're presently without a Secretary of Defense. We have a brand new Secretary of State. Gary Seymour is here at this conference in his capacity as not a government official. He was the White House czar, as it was said, for weapons of mass destruction. So he will be a key player in any review, probably in the interagency process. That person will run the review. He has not yet been replaced. So there's a lot of unsettlement in the transition to a new administration. With respect to the relationship to the Iranian elections, this is a rerun of a calculation that the Obama administration had to make in 2009. They hesitated about moving too fast with Iran in 2009 because of the elections. And then when the elections turned out to be turbulent, this was very disruptive of their planned engagement approach. But in the interim, I believe that the administration has settled very strongly on a view that the key player in Iran is the supreme leader. And that's a factor of continuousness that's not really affected by the elections in Iran. And if you look at the recent couple of years of efforts of the Obama administration, much of their effort has been directed at trying to communicate directly with the supreme leader. And insofar as that's the view, I think the elections are not something they would have to wait around for. They'll be very happy, though, to see the backside of Mr. Ahmadinejad. The last point I would make just on the sanctions question, if you go back and look at the World Bank statistics or the WTO, the World Trade Organization data on Iran, or the CIA estimates, what you'll see is that over the decade or so, the last decade or so, when Iran has been heavily sanctioned due to this nuclear crisis, they've averaged between 5 and 8% real growth per year. An American president who delivered that kind of performance would be president for life. So what you can argue is maybe Iran should have been more like China. Maybe it should have been 8 or 10% as opposed to 5 or 8%. But it's hard to see that at 5% real growth, they've been so choked that they had to make major concessions that they believed violated their national sovereignty.
Okay, I think it's time to wrap up our panel. Okay, please join me thanking to our panelists for today. Thank you so much.